UFC Norfolk, David Figueiredo. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that pronunciation. Versus Joseph Benavidez. Now that one came. It crept under the radar. In the month of March, we've seen a lot of UFC events, and I think it's a great time to be a fight fan and definitely a UFC fan. I think before we even go into this fight, which was really exciting, let's zoom back and see the landscape currently of the UFC featherweight division, the flyweight division. So the current, the champion reigning was Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo obviously jumped up to bantamweight and fought TJ Dillashaw, who is now suspended. Oh, the drama. And he defended the belt at the bantamweight weight class versus Marlon Moraes, which was an amazing fight, generally an amazing fight, and we really got to see the chops of Henry Cejudo as a fighter and an athlete and an individual that overcomes adversity. So that's a great fight in its own accord. So what happens here is Henry Cejudo, who is currently recovering from this fight, looks to be in a very enviable position, and he's actually looking to be teeing up a fight at bantamweight with Jose Aldo. So this leaves the flyweights in a conundrum with no champion, and as a result, UFC made Henry vacate the title, and we're fighting for a champion rather. So in comes Joseph Benavidez, David Figueiredo. So who doesn't know Joseph Benavidez? If you've been following the UFC and mixed martial arts as a whole, stand-up guy. I've heard this saying that he's always been the bridesmaid but never the bride. He's basically always been a fighter that's been up there, a top 5 fighter in his weight class, but never quite made it. Interestingly enough, it was him and Demetrius Johnson that fought for the initial, flyweight title, and that was a really tough fight. One that Demetrius Johnson won, and I guess the rest is history in terms of how dominant Demetrius was in terms of cementing his legacy and his place at that particular weight class. But just a bit of context there. So really, where this was coming at was the UFC was spinning a lot of wheels to ensure that the flyweight division had a champion, and really the wheels were aligned in terms of a real straight narrative for Joseph Benavidez to come in and finally got that championship that he was looking for a long time, and my goodness, did he deserve it in that particular round. Insert David Figueiredo, Brazilian striker, cut in the mold of really aggressive Brazilian strikers with that background of, coming from really, really humble beginnings. Personally, I haven't watched a lot of fights of him, but, based on the highlights, he is an extremely high-level striker with knockout power, which is really one of the critiques, of the flyweight division in terms of individuals don't have knockout power, and you have these little energizer bunnies jumping back and forth and exchanging, which is really exciting. But in the end of the day, fans want to see finishes, and knockouts and TKOs are really amongst the most exciting variants of what that kind of looks like. So the short of it is these two guys come in. You've got this story and narrative that's already been built in terms of Benavidez potentially, swooping in and getting that. Interestingly enough, and this is a conundrum, and there's a more holistic chat to be had here in terms of weight cutting and how this manifests itself. David Figueiredo missed weight. So we've had scenarios such as this, and I can't remember the most recent one, but Yoel Romero springs to mind in terms of when he missed weight and he didn't have the opportunity to potentially be champion. So what this meant was if David won, he would not be champion. There would basically be a stalemate, and the flyweight division wouldn't have any champion. So really odd set of circumstances, and really one that really drove the narrative that, it was Benavidez's time. But interesting, the fight went on. David Figueiredo lost 30% of his purse, in which is what is kind of a standard agreement for individuals that miss weight in that particular regard. I guess where this was amplified was the fact that it was meant to be a championship fight. So the short of it is they come in and they start engaging. David switching, from orthodox to southpaw as he normally does, really confusing the hell out of it. And what was really apparent in the initial exchanges was that Benavidez was going for gold, and that he didn't necessarily only want to win, but he wanted to win with devastating fashion, throwing the overhand with reckless abandon. And really, I think it was picked up by the commentators, leaving his chin quite exposed in that particular regard. Initially, what we see is a very intense and strong sort of scramble, of which it looked like David was going to submit Joseph. Very weird sort of scramble, really. Ended up in terms of a semi armbar position, but then we have both fighters coming out of it and really swing to death at the back end of the first round. Essentially, when the break of the first round occurs, we note that Joseph's corner feels that they've won that round, and they feel that this is going to be a fight based in terms of cardio, because Figueiredo was throwing a lot and looked to be the fighter that was, chewing in terms of the gas tank. The second round comes out and they both engage in the similar sort of manner, and again this narrative that Benavidez was absolutely going for broke in terms of his strike was there, and it looked like there was a lot of semi-clinch engagements that happened in the middle, not necessarily at the corner of the cage. And here there were basically a lot of clashes of bodies in which David was pushing Joseph off, and Joseph was coming with really awkward sort of strikes, attempting to land what he hoped would be, a strike to end the match. And I think this is really interesting here, because what it shows was there was a fair amount of reckless abandon in Joseph's corner, whether it came from two elements. One, in that he really wanted to finish the fight, and he wanted to finish the fight in devastating fashion, to really put an exclamation mark that he deserved what he was going to get. Or one in that, it was the game plan. They potentially saw some holes in the defense of Deiveson Figueiredo and saw that as a way to engage there. Whatever the reasoning, Joseph was going really heavy and hard there, not necessarily mixing it up with the wrestling, to which, he had a really good pedigree in that particular regard. So David, a very awkward sort of striker, moving back and forth and really pushing off, and the taller of the fighter, not by much in that particular regard. Now, where the fight concludes is a very interesting interchange. So what happens is David and Joseph both engage in what appears to be a pretty heavy head knock. And upon that head knock and the disengage of the head knock, you see blood appearing straight away. Now, when this is viewed in real time, it appears that it's not necessarily that the audience sees a head knock, but we see blood. We see blood coming out pretty profusely at that. So there is an assumption here that at this stage, David has, given a sharp punch somewhere along the line, or within that exchange, there might have been an elbow kind of exchange to really open up that cut. And Joseph is clearly dazed in this particular regard, as he takes a couple of steps back towards the cage. And this is where David, cocks that right hand and zaps him with a laser straight on the noggin. And this is as Joseph gets back, and the rest was history. Wow, what an amazing punch. And an amazing fight. There was a lot of, back and forth engagements there, and that initial scramble was extremely exciting, especially for those that understand that nuance of the game. And I guess really what was interesting here was just how desperate may be the wrong word, but how aggressive it seemed Joseph was to really engage in the striking warfare, and the risks that he was willing to take basically to get there. And interestingly enough, it wasn't an opening from, his recklessness, potentially the wrong word, in throwing his overhand that got him there, but essentially a head clash to which, he came off second best in that particular regard. And he looked dazed and really worse for wear. And David followed him, and that heat-sinking missile that was the right for Figueiredo ended it. And it was emphatic, and there was no doubt who the victor was there. It hurt. It landed flush on his face, and away she wrote. And I think it's really interesting, because now we're presented with a scenario where we have a fighter that clearly won. I mean, there's no doubt in that he deserved to win, and he won. Maybe not emphatically, he wasn't beating him, throughout at the stand-up war, but there can be no doubt of how the fight was finished. But we don't have a champion in flyweight. So again, the UFC is really writing these interesting narratives in terms of, what happens next. So do they run this back? Does Joseph want to run this back? I mean, you got to feel for the guy, and he was absolutely devastated. We had shades of Daniel Cormier versus John Jones in terms of that interview that Michael Bisping had from him. He was devastated. He held his own, but you can tell this guy has been there. It was his third time, and it just, for some reason, for better or worse, he's good enough to get there, but he's not good enough to close. And one can only imagine as a fighter and as just a competitor, that's a really shocking place to be at. Look, it's really interesting. I think you potentially play this back. The flyweight division doesn't necessarily have a lot of upcoming talent with big names there, and it was an exciting fight, and that's one way to look at it. Again, this Norfolk fight of the night wasn't overly stacked. You had some names in Megan Anderson and the Hulk. I forgot his name, and that's an interesting fight because it ended really controversially. Potentially, we'll have a recap here as well. But we're in flux, so we go a couple of months without a flyweight champion. Henry Cejudo is scheduled to fight Marlon Moraes, and one would think that, not Marlon Moraes, sorry, Jose Aldo, and one would think the outcome of that fight really has grave implications of what happens here. So, for example, if he beats Aldo, which one would think, based on the recent run of form and the momentum that he's having, is potentially leaning that way. He's got to be a favorite. Surely he's got to be a favorite. But if Aldo beats him, then I think he slots back here and versus David. What would you say? Interesting. A lot of things to happen there. So guys, leave comments. Subscribe to the channel below if you haven't already. And I don't know if you've already noticed, but we've started to get some merch for MMA Live TV. This is a snapback that I'm modeling over here. If you like it, leave some comments, drop some feedback into my inbox, and I'll be definitely looking to put this up live in a store. So hope to hear from you guys soon. Peace.